Ancient mining pits older than the pyramids, hundreds of millions of pounds of pure copper that vanished from the historical record, and a wilderness island where someone dug into solid rock thousands of years before Rome existed. For more than a century, people stood on the shores of Lake Superior and asked the same question: who did this? Who carved these pits into the bedrock, hauled copper out of the earth in quantities that stagger modern geologists, and then seemingly disappeared? In the 1800s they came up with an answer, a dramatic one: a lost race of giants or Egyptians, or some vanished super-civilization that ruled North America before the tribes ever arrived. Newspapers printed it, so-called experts repeated it, and that story spread across the continent like wildfire. But here's the thing, that answer was wrong. Completely, provably wrong. And the truth they buried underneath it is far more incredible than any lost race of giants. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Because the people who mined this copper were real. They had names, families, and trade routes that stretched more than 1,000 miles across the continent. Their descendants are still here today. And the story of how they got erased from their own history is one of the strangest and most unsettling chapters in all of American archaeology. This is what really lies beneath Lake Superior. Let us dig in. To understand what's down there, you first have to understand the lake itself. And Lake Superior is not a normal lake. It's the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area. It holds enough water to cover both North and South America under a full foot of liquid. It is so deep and so cold that the old sailors used to say, "The lake never gives up her dead," because the water stays too frigid for bodies to ever rise back to the surface. Ships that sank 100 years ago are still down there in the dark, perfectly preserved, their crews still aboard. The Ojibwe people, who have lived along these shores for centuries, called it Gume, the Great Sea. And if you've ever heard that name before, it might be from the old Longfellow poem or from the Gordon Lightfoot song about a shipwreck. But to the Ojibwe, Gume was never just a poem. It was home, it was a provider, and it was sacred. Now, at the end of the last ice age, this entire region looked nothing like it does today. Massive glaciers, some of them over a mile thick, had ground their way across the land and then slowly melted back over thousands of years. As they retreated, they left behind enormous lakes, and they exposed something that had been locked in the bedrock for over 1 billion years. Copper. But not just any copper. This was native copper. Pure, metallic copper sitting right there in the rock, ready to be worked. In most of the world, you cannot simply find usable metal lying around. You have to smelt it out of ore using intense heat and complex chemistry that took humans thousands of years to figure out. But around Lake Superior, geological forces had already done the hard part. They had concentrated copper into massive veins and nuggets of nearly pure metal. Some of these copper masses were small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. Others weighed literally tons. And this metal was scattered across the Keweenaw Peninsula, that long finger of land that juts out into the lake from Michigan's Upper Peninsula and across a remote, wind-swept island called Isle Royale. For thousands of years, this was the richest and purest source of copper anywhere on the entire continent. And people knew it. The question was, when did they know it? And how far back does the mining actually go? In the 1840s, prospectors began pouring into the Lake Superior region during America's first great mining boom. They came looking for copper to feed the hungry engines of the Industrial Revolution. But when they arrived, they found something that stopped them cold in their tracks. The copper had already been mined. Not all of it, but a great deal of it, and not recently. Across the Keweenaw Peninsula, and especially on Isle Royale, the miners discovered thousands of ancient pits. Depressions in the ground, some shallow, some 15 or 20 feet deep, following the copper veins with an uncanny precision. Whoever had dug these had known exactly where the metal was hiding beneath the surface. And inside these pits, and scattered all around them, the prospectors found tools, thousands upon thousands of them, rounded stones called hammerstones, some weighing as much as 40 pounds, many with grooves worn into them where wooden handles had once been lashed on, wooden shovels and levers, charcoal from ancient fires, and in some places massive slabs of copper that had been partially detached from the bedrock and then, for reasons nobody could explain, simply left behind. On Isle Royale, one of these abandoned copper masses weighed more than 6 tons. The ancient miners had dug it out, raised it up on cribbing made of stacked logs, and worked at it, hammering off pieces one at a time. But they never took the whole thing. It was still sitting there, waiting, when the 19th century miners stumbled onto it. Think about what that actually means. Somebody, long ago, had the knowledge, the labour force, and the raw engineering skill to locate a 6-ton copper mass buried in solid rock, dig all the way down to it, and lift it up off the ground. Without metal tools, without draft animals, without even the wheel. And the technique they used was genuinely ingenious. The miners would build fires directly against the rock face to heat it, then throw cold water on the hot stone. Fire and water, expansion and contraction, cracking the bedrock apart little by little. Then they would move in with those heavy hammerstones, pounding away at the fractured rock and the copper veins running through it. It was slow. It was brutal, back-breaking work. And they did it, season after season, generation after generation, for thousands of years. The tools they left behind tell the story of that staggering labour. On Isle Royale alone, researchers have documented tens of thousands of these hammerstones. Whole stretches of the island's beaches are made partly of the shattered, discarded stones the miners wore out and tossed aside. Imagine the number of hands, the number of entire lifetimes, represented in a pile of broken tools that large. And Isle Royale itself makes the mystery even harder to explain away. This is not some convenient spot near a village. It is a remote island, out in the open water of the largest, coldest, most dangerous freshwater lake on the planet. To mine there, the ancient people had to cross miles of frigid, unpredictable water in canoes, carrying their tools, their food, and everything they needed to survive. They did this seasonally, coming and going with the weather, working the copper veins, and then paddling the finished metal back to the mainland. Nobody stumbles onto an island like that, by accident, and starts a mining operation. They went there on purpose, again and again, because they knew exactly what was waiting in the rock. That kind of sustained, organized effort, across open water, over thousands of years, is not the mark of a primitive people fumbling in the dark. It is the mark of a culture that understood its world with real precision. The scale of it was overwhelming. Estimates of the total copper removed from the Lake Superior region in ancient times run into the hundreds of millions of pounds. Some researchers have thrown out wild numbers as high as £1.5 billion, though those figures are hotly debated and almost certainly inflated. But even the careful, conservative estimates describe an industrial operation that ran on and off for thousands of years. And here is where it gets strange. When the prospectors of the 1800s asked the local tribes about the pits, they often got answers that seemed to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. Some accounts claimed the tribe said they did not know who made the pits, that the mines had been there long before their people arrived. Now we have to be very careful here, because these accounts were written down by white settlers who frequently misunderstood, mistranslated, or simply invented what they claimed native people had told them. But the perception took hold anyway, and that perception became the poisonous seed of a very dangerous idea. Here is what you have to understand about America in the 1800s. The country was in the middle of aggressively expanding westward, pushing native peoples off their ancestral land, breaking treaty after treaty, and forcing tribes onto reservations at gunpoint. And this created a deeply uncomfortable problem for the national conscience. If the land had belonged to sophisticated, ancient civilizations, then taking it looked an awful lot like theft. But if the native peoples were merely recent arrivals, primitive newcomers who had themselves displaced some earlier and greater civilization, then the entire moral picture conveniently changed. Suddenly, the settlers weren't stealing. They were just the latest in a long line of conquerors. And so a myth was born. or really, a whole sprawling family of myths. The idea that before the tribes, some lost race had built the great earthworks, mined the copper, and ruled the continent in glory. People credited these achievements to the ancient Egyptians, to the Phoenicians, to a lost tribe of Israel, to the survivors of Atlantis, to wandering Welsh princes, to a vanished race of giant men, to almost anyone, in fact, except the native peoples who were actually standing right there in front of them. This became known as the mound builder myth because it centered on the enormous earthen mounds scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, and some of these mounds were genuinely staggering. Monk's Mound at Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, is a terraced earthwork larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was the centerpiece of a city that, at its peak around the year 1100, may have held more people than London did at the very same moment in history. 19th century Americans looked at these mounds. They looked at the copper mines. They looked at all of it, and they decided that native people simply could not possibly have built any of it. Not because there was a shred of real evidence, but because admitting the truth was politically and morally inconvenient. The copper mines of Lake Superior became Exhibit A in this fantasy. Newspapers ran breathless stories about the lost miners of the North. Amateur theorists connected the copper to ancient Old World civilizations, arguing that Mediterranean sailors must have crossed the Atlantic to strip the mines bare and haul the metal home to fuel the Bronze Age. Some claimed the copper ended up in the tombs of the pharaohs. Others insisted a race of giants had done all the digging. And I want to be crystal clear about something. These were not just harmless campfire stories. This mythology did real, lasting damage. It handed people a moral justification for taking native land, and it stole the actual accomplishments of real human beings and gave them to imaginary strangers. Every single time someone credited that copper to a lost race of giants, they were quietly robbing the people who really earned it. So who did earn it? Because here is the twist that changes everything. We now know exactly who mined the copper. And it was not giants or Egyptians or Atlanteans. It was the ancestors of the very native peoples who had been standing right there the entire time. Starting in the 20th century, archaeologists finally did something the 19th century mythmakers had never bothered to do. They actually studied the evidence scientifically. They dug carefully and methodically. They dated the charcoal from those ancient fires. And what they found rewrote the entire story. The mining was not the work of some vanished foreign civilization. It was the work of indigenous North Americans, and it was astonishingly, almost unbelievably old. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal and preserved wooden tools from the mining sites pushed the dates back thousands upon thousands of years. Some of the earliest copper working around Lake Superior dates back at least 6,000 years, and some estimates push it even further, to as much as 9,000 years ago. Let that number settle in for a moment. That means people were mining and working metal here in North America thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt were even a plan on a drawing board, before Stonehenge was raised, before the invention of writing anywhere on the face of the earth. Archaeologists gave this civilization a name, the Old Copper Culture, and it represents one of the oldest known metalworking traditions anywhere on the entire planet. The old copper people did not smelt the metal, because they never needed to. Remember, this was pure native copper. So instead, they developed a sophisticated technique called cold hammering, combined with careful, controlled heating. They would heat the copper in their fires to make it softer and more workable, then hammer it into shape, then heat it again when it grew brittle, a process metalworkers call annealing, over and over. Heating, hammering, cooling, and heating again, until they had formed exactly what they wanted. And what they made was beautiful. Spear points and knife blades sharp enough to hunt and butcher game, fish hooks and harpoons for the waters of the Great Lake, awls, needles, and chisels, bracelets, beads, and gleaming ornaments. Some of these objects were purely practical, tools for survival. Others were clearly prestige items, symbols of status and wealth, buried alongside important people as precious grave goods. These were not crude, fumbling attempts. They were sophisticated, standardized, and produced in enormous quantities across thousands of years. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. The old copper culture had, in effect, built one of the world's very first metal industries, right here on the shores of Gitche-Gumee. And who were these people exactly? They were hunters, fishers and gatherers who lived across the western Great Lakes region during a long period archaeologists call the Archaic. They followed the seasons, moving to take advantage of fish runs, game, wild plants, and of course, the copper. They lived in a world without cities, without the kind of agriculture we would easily recognize, and yet they sustained a metalworking tradition that lasted longer than all of recorded human history has been running. That is a point genuinely worth pausing on. When we imagine ancient metalworkers, we almost always picture great empires, Bronze Age kingdoms, pharaohs and gleaming palaces. But the old copper people were not an empire. They were relatively small, mobile communities. And yet they achieved something those grand civilizations did too, and in some respects they did it earlier. It quietly demolishes the whole comfortable idea that you need cities and kings to accomplish something truly remarkable. Interestingly, over the long centuries, the old copper people seem to have shifted away from using copper for heavy-duty tools like axes and spear points, and moved toward using it more for ornaments and objects of ceremony and prestige. Archaeologists still debate exactly why. Maybe stone and bone tools simply worked well enough for the daily grind of survival. Maybe copper became more valuable as a shining symbol of status and spiritual power than as a practical material for everyday work. Either way, it tells us these were people with rich social and ceremonial lives, with copper woven right through the very center of them. It is worth stopping to picture what a copper tool actually meant to a person living 8,000 years ago. Before metal, almost everything was made of stone, bone, wood, or antler. These materials worked, but they were limited. Stone shatters, bone dulls and breaks, but a copper knife could be sharpened, rebent, and reshaped when it wore down. A copper awl could punch clean through tough hide. A copper fish hook held its point through a whole season of fishing. For the people who owned these things, copper was not a luxury. It was a genuine leap forward in what a human being could do with their hands. And the fact that it also gleamed, that it caught the firelight and the sun like nothing else in their world, only made it more precious. It was useful, and it was beautiful, and that rare combination is exactly what turned it into an object of trade and of reverence. And the copper did not stay local. This is perhaps the most stunning part of the whole story. Lake Superior copper has been found at archaeological sites across an enormous swath of North America, not just around the Great Lakes, but far, far beyond them. Copper artifacts traced back to these specific mines have turned up in the American Southeast, along the Gulf Coast, out onto the wide Great Plains, and all the way down through the Mississippi Valley. Some of it travelled well over 1,000 miles from the pit where it was first dug out of the ground. That means that thousands of years ago, there was a continent-spanning trade network moving Lake Superior copper across North America. This was not a scattering of isolated, disconnected tribes. This was an interconnected web of peoples, exchanging goods, ideas, and materials over vast and difficult distances, long before any European ever set foot on the continent. And the way scientists can prove the copper came from Lake Superior is clever. Copper from different sources carries a slightly different chemical signature, a specific mix of trace elements and isotopes, almost like a fingerprint pressed into the metal itself. By analyzing artifacts found hundreds or even thousands of miles away and matching their chemistry back to the Lake Superior deposits, researchers can trace the exact journey that metal took. Piece by piece, they have reconstructed the map of an ancient economy that most people alive today have never even heard of. Later cultures continued and dramatically expanded this network. The people archaeologists call the Hopewell, who flourished around 2,000 years ago, ran trade systems that pulled in copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, obsidian from the distant Rocky Mountains, and shells from the Gulf of Mexico. They worked that Lake Superior copper into breathtaking ceremonial objects, hammered into impossibly thin sheets, and cut into the shapes of soaring birds and human hands and beautiful abstract designs. And later still, the great city of Cahokia, the one with the mound larger than the Great Pyramid, sat at the beating heart of a Mississippian world that prized copper as a sacred material, deeply associated with the sun, with power, and with the spirit realm itself. For many of these cultures, copper was never just a useful metal. It carried deep and powerful spiritual meaning. Its warm reddish gleam, its strange softness, its connection to the deep earth, all of it made copper a substance of the supernatural. And the source of the finest, purest copper on the entire continent was Gitche-Gumee, Lake Superior. The Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe peoples who lived around the lake had their own deep and enduring traditions connected to the copper. In their stories, the metal was tied to powerful beings and sacred forces that lived in and around the water. There were traditions of respect and even caution around taking it from the earth. Some accounts describe the copper as belonging to spirit beings and speak of the need to give offerings in exchange for whatever was taken from the ground. So when 19th century settlers claimed that the local tribes knew nothing at all about the mines, we should be deeply, deeply skeptical, because the living traditions tell a very different story. A story of a people with a long, spiritual, and intensely practical relationship to the copper of the Great Lake. A relationship that stretched back not hundreds, but thousands of years into the past. Now, I promised you giant trees beneath the lake. And there is a real phenomenon here, though it is not at all what the myth peddlers would have you believe. Remember how the entire landscape here was violently reshaped at the end of the Ice Age. As the glaciers melted and the land itself rebounded and shifted, the water levels across the Great Lakes basin rose and fell dramatically over thousands of years. Areas that had once been dry land, covered in thick forest, eventually ended up underwater. And in some places the remains of those ancient drowned forests are still down there in the cold. In the frigid, oxygen-poor depths of the Great Lakes, wood can be preserved for an astonishing length of time. Divers and researchers have documented submerged trees and old forest floors beneath the surface of various parts of the Great Lakes, drowned long ago when the waters rose over them. These are not petrified, in the strict geological sense, turned fully to stone, but they are ancient waterlogged remnants of forests that grew when the shoreline sat somewhere very, very different from where it is today. And in the broader Great Lakes region, there are also genuinely petrified and fossilized remains reaching back into far deeper time. This part of the world preserves an incredible geological record, stretching back through ages when the land was covered by warm ancient seas, and at other times by strange forests utterly unlike anything alive today. So the haunting image of drowned trees beneath the Great Lake is not fantasy, it is real. It is just not evidence of any lost super-civilization. It is evidence of something that is arguably far more profound. Deep time. The almost unimaginable span of years over which this one landscape has transformed itself, again and again and again. Consider the sheer dizzying sweep of it. The basalt rock that holds the copper formed more than 1 billion years ago, back when this part of the continent was literally tearing itself apart along a great volcanic rift. Lava poured out and cooled, trapping the copper inside it. Then came hundreds of millions of years of slow erosion, of ancient seas rising and falling, of entire ecosystems living and dying and being buried. Then the ice ages, glaciers a mile thick, grinding back and forth across the land, scraping away the surface and exposing the copper the ancient rift had made. Then the meltwater, the shifting lakes, the slow drowning of the forests. And only at the very, very end of all of that, in a sliver of time so thin it barely registers, did human beings finally arrive and begin to dig. When you hold a single piece of Lake Superior copper in your hand, you are holding something that connects all of it. The rift that made the metal, the ice that revealed it, the ancient miners who worked it with fire and stone. It is a single unbroken thread, running through more than 1 billion years of history, ending in a human palm. So how did we finally move past the lost race fantasy? How did the truth eventually claw its way out into the light? It happened slowly, and it happened because of careful, patient, unglamorous science. In the late 1800s, the Smithsonian Institution launched a series of serious investigations into the mound question. A researcher named Cyrus Thomas, who had actually started out as a believer in the lost race theory himself, was put in charge of studying the mounds systematically and settling the matter once and for all. And when Thomas and his team actually did the work, digging carefully, cataloguing everything they found, comparing the evidence piece by piece, they reached a conclusion that utterly demolished the myth. The mounds had been built by the direct ancestors of living native peoples. There was no lost race. There never had been. The evidence pointed, overwhelmingly and undeniably, straight back to indigenous Americans. Thomas published his findings in a massive, thorough report in 1894. It was one of the great turning points in the history of American archaeology. The lost race theory, at least among serious and honest scholars, was finished. The very same thing happened with the copper. As radiocarbon dating and modern archaeology matured over the 20th century, the picture became absolutely undeniable. The miners of Lake Superior were the ancestors of the Anishinaabe and other native peoples. The old copper culture was indigenous. The 1,000-mile trade networks were indigenous. Every last piece of it was indigenous. But here is the truly frustrating part. Even after the science had settled the question over a century ago, the myth simply refused to die. To this very day, you can find books, videos, and entire websites still pushing the tired idea that ancient Europeans, or lost giants, or some vanished super-civilization were the real miners of Lake Superior. The lie is remarkably stubbornly durable, and that is because it was never really about the evidence in the first place. So let's return to where we started. To that question people kept asking, standing on the wild shores of Gitche-Gumee. Who did this? The answer, it turns out, is both far simpler and far more remarkable than the myth ever was. It was done by real people. Indigenous North Americans, working the copper of the Great Lake for thousands of years in one of the oldest metalworking traditions anywhere on Earth. People who built continent-spanning trade routes with their own hands and feet. People who created objects of stunning beauty and craft. And people whose descendants are still here today, still connected to this land and this water. What was really lost was never a race of giants. What was very nearly lost was the truth itself. For a century and more, an entire civilization's genuine achievements were stolen and handed over to imaginary strangers. The real miners were carefully written out of their own story, so that the theft of their land might feel just a little more justified. And once you truly understand that, the copper beneath Lake Superior stops being a spooky mystery about vanished giants. It becomes something much more powerful, a testament. Hard physical evidence, still sitting patiently in the rock, of a deep and sophisticated indigenous past that the mythmakers tried so hard, and ultimately failed, to erase from memory. Those thousands of ancient pits scattered across Isle Royale and the Keweenaw. Those 40-pound hammerstones worn smooth by countless working hands. That great 6-ton copper mass raised up on its wooden cribbing and then left behind who knows how many thousands of years ago. They are not the ghosts of a lost race. They are the fingerprints of the people who were here all along. The great sea keeps its secrets well. The cold, dark water still holds drowned forests from a vanished shoreline, and copper still veins the ancient rock beneath it. But the biggest secret of all, the true identity of the miners, is not a secret anymore, and it never really should have been one. They mined the Great Lake for 6,000 years, and maybe far longer. They moved its shining copper 1,000 miles in every direction across the continent. They wove that metal into their tools, their art, and their sacred world. And then a myth came along and tried to take every last bit of it away from them. But the rock remembers. The pits remain. And the truth, once you finally know where to look for it, is written plainly into the shores of Gitche-Gumee, waiting there for anyone willing to open their eyes and see it. The petrified giants beneath Lake Superior were never really giants at all. They were something far better. They were real, and they were here first.